The topic of the origins debate in the 21st century is extremely complicated. There are a lot of different angles to understanding the first 11 chapters of Genesis due to how different our culture is today compared to how they thought back then. Many want to say Genesis 1 is as clear as it gets. Even a child can understand it. Even in Genesis 1 to 2 alone, there is an extraordinary amount of complexity, all of which completely changes how we read the text. The text in general is hard to get the exact meaning due to our distance from the original context of the narrative, as well as the complicated and ambiguous language of Hebrew. This has implications for how we see God, the doctrine of creation out of nothing, how old the earth is, and many more. Today we discuss ambiguity in the first two verses as to translation, meaning, and the significance of the passage. Before we begin, I want to note I will not discuss every single view possible, but more of just the popular ones. Make sure to like and subscribe for when I go into detail about why these scholars take these views, but also check out the description as I will link different videos that have already been made about some of these topics. A hot topic right now in biblical studies is how to translate the very first word in Genesis 1:1. The very first word in the Bible, Bereshit, where the question is, how do we translate it from Hebrew to English? The traditional way would be to translate the word as in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, while a translation growing in popularity, and maybe even the more popular view among scholars right now, would be to translate and interpret Bereshit as if the latter. Most scholars would argue the first sentence should be translated as a relative clause, forming one entire sentence with verses 1, 2, and 3 combined instead of one sentence of just Genesis 1:1 alone. It would look something like, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was yada yada yada. Or, in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, yada yada yada. According to nearly all Bible translators, this view would mean the formless and empty waters, and maybe the entire earth mentioned in verse 2 would have already existed before God started creating. You don't get young with creation from the Bible if the Bible never tells when the earth was created. In addition, you don't get God creating out of nothing or even the creation of time in Genesis 1:1. You can argue the doctrine of creation ex nihilo from other passages in Genesis 1 or in the Bible, but not this verse. In this case, that verse just doesn't mention creation ex nihilo. Under this view, it is grammatically impossible that Genesis 1:1 is describing God acting out creation out of nothing. Current translations include the NRSVUE, CEB, TLB, and JPS version of 1985. Check out this playlist if you want a better understanding of the view. If you think the arguments are good enough to translate Genesis 1 as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the most popular way among scholars to understand this verse, when translated this way, is to interpret as a summary statement for the entire narrative of Genesis 1:2 to 2:3. Just like the when God began to create translation. This would imply that the waters of verse 2 are already present before the narrative begins, and God starts creating in verse 3. If a summary statement, it can still be creation ex nihilo of everything except the waters and earth mentioned in Genesis 1:2, but only because it's summarizing what's happening in Genesis 1. The third most popular view among scholars is to read it as describing the first act of creation. Of the few scholars that take this view, nearly all think it's creation out of nothing. A fourth view is to read Genesis 1:1 as an independent clause where God creates the heavens and the earth sometime before the narrative begins in Genesis 1:3. A fifth view is to understand the first word as in the beginning, but it refers not to the very, very beginning of time or the world, but to a general range of time or time periods before Genesis 1:3 occurs. There is debate about what the second word bara, typically translated as create, means in the text. The word bara has a lot of different meanings, just like create does in English. Some think it is creation out of nothing, creation from previous material, or even separating. John Walton argues it refers to something like ordering the cosmos and assigning function and purpose to it, and therefore has nothing at all to do with physically moving anything. There is debate in scholarship as to the meaning of Hashemayim and Haaretz, typically translated something like the heavens and the earth. One way to see it is to look at it as the entire universe as we know it in the 21st century, because something like heavens and earth can be seen as a merism. Some examples of merisms are first and last and day and night. The words don't have to include everything, but it really is something more like the heavens and the earth and all in between. Many scholars think the standard translation is deceiving, since the ancient Israelite would not have viewed the earth and heavens like we do today. Of the scholars that take the view, the heavens and the earth would look something close to that right there. Another way is to translate it as dry land and waters, which would be more accurate to what they considered the earth, since they didn't understand things like the earth being a circular globe. Some scholars think Genesis 1 does not imply the creation out of everything, but just the heavens and the earth, but nothing else. Another question is to whether the Eretz or earth referred to in 1:1 is the same as the Eretz in Genesis 1:2. Scott Nogle concludes an interesting meaning to the Eretz in both verses, which is to translate it as underworld, which is essentially the same thing as Sheol. In other words, God created the heavens and the underworld, which could still mean Genesis 1:1 is saying God created everything, or just the two things in this verse. We know Genesis 1:2 is considered background information apart from the narrative due to the disjunctive waw at the beginning of the verse, which means that it's impossible for there to be a gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. You heard me. What you think of as the gap theory is impossible. Check out this view if you want to learn more about that. Now, on to our second word of verse 2. Eretz, or the earth, might be considered what was created in Genesis 1:1, or it might refer to something like the earth as we understand what it looks like today, and then that earth was tohu wabohu. Some translate tohu wabohu as waste and void, formless and empty, wilter and waste. The words describe a condition that is without form and empty. This could be something like waters and darkness with the earth underneath, or maybe no earth at all, although some argue it refers to the uninhabitable land. Another interesting question is what the Ruach Elohim means in verse 1:2. Some consider it to be the same as the Holy Spirit mentioned in the New Testament, which is theoretically possible, but the writer of Genesis most certainly would have had something different in mind, given the writer was speaking in a completely different context. In addition, the NET Bible footnote mentions elsewhere in the Old Testament, the phrase refers consistently to the divine spirit that empowers and energizes individuals. So it's therefore translated as Spirit of God. Some have argued that it should be translated as Wind of God due to a similar Egyptian concept, but that's not a very popular view. As you can see, there's a ridiculous amount of complexity among these two verses alone, and that's mostly just the more popular views among scholars. Anyways, thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to guarantee you don't miss when I talk with these scholars about each of these in the future.